All right, well, I'm here today with Pastor Josh Moore, the pastor of United Church in South Royalton, Vermont, otherwise known as Red Door Church. So Pastor Josh is a good friend of mine. I could just talk with him for hours and hours, but this is the second part of my conversation series, and we know that you probably are limited in the amount of time you have, so we're not going to talk for hours and hours, but we are going to talk for a while here, and I'm just so glad that Pastor Josh agreed to come on this program and talk to us today. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Yeah, so great. So you're here at South Royalton, Vermont, and otherwise known as, the church is known as Red Door Church. Yep. So why do they call it that?
Well, the obvious reason is because the door is red.
Oh, wow!
So it's I gather it's kind of a New England thing that folks like to have these quaint names for churches. So not too far from here is a red brick church, and So it's really a competition thing. Oh, you got red brick? Well, we've got a red door. That's right. That's right. And so I think as far as why they painted the door red, maybe. I know back in the mid-1800s, before I guess the advent of modern chemistry and whatnot, they used blood and milk. I think maybe buttermilk. They used to paint buildings. Actually,
wow.
I guess the buttermilk provided
blood from animals.
Yeah, they'd use blood from animals. Yeah, yes, of course. No human sacrifice going on, but they used animal blood and buttermilk to paint, and that's why you see so many red barns around, and so I don't know if that's where it started. Just that's what they had available, so they painted it red, or if there was some kind of theological significance to it.
I mean, that's what I was thinking. Of course, being having a pastor mindset, you think theological things, but I mean that idea of blood being used within the paint, and then that's the doorway into the church here. Yep. Yeah, that's kind of symbolic.
Yeah, and honestly, it's really a really sweet notion. The idea of, a lot of churches. Actually, I did a little research on this when I first got here, but there's a number of churches that have red doors, and
wow.
And I've seen a few around here, but just in general, if you go and Google, red door churches, you're going to find
many,
lots of churches with red doors, and I think some of that is because of the theological significance there of entering by the blood of Christ into the presence of God.
Wow.
You think of Passover, the connections in the Old Testament with Passover, and the idea of blood on the door. There's a lot there. I know Episcopal churches. That's a common identification for Episcopal church. You go down the road, see a church with a red door.
Wow.
It's a good chance it's an Episcopal church. I've heard. I could go on.
See, I'm Baptist, so we're not really good on symbols. To be honest, whatever. As long as you have a door, that's just make sure you can get in somehow. Yeah. Could be whatever color. So it's United Church, though.
Yes.
So tell me about that. Is it a certain denomination?
Yeah. So this church is federated, which was not something that I was familiar with until I came to New England.
Huh.
And I guess the idea of a federated church is a church that has membership in multiple denominations.
Okay.
And so this church in particular is United Methodist and United Church of Christ. So some years ago, again, we'd have to go back out there and look at the board to get the exact date, but maybe 50, 60 years ago, there was a merger between the local United Methodist Church and the Congregational Church, or the United Church of Christ. They decided to merge and to have a plan of united action, was I think the way they put it in the bylaws. And so that's when it became federated. And,
so the two denominations were, did you say Methodist and Congregational?
Yes.
Okay. So you're right, that isn't something you'd probably see where you're from.
No.
But in New England, where we have smaller churches, and frankly, I think some of the mainline, some of the historic denominations have lessened in their amount of people attending, maybe. So there have been some mergers, I think, right?
Yeah.
Probably over the years. That's something to do with it.
Yeah.
Now, you're from the South, where, of course, there's small churches down south, but there's some pretty big churches down south, too.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
So where are you from?
So originally from North Carolina. I've lived most of my life in North Carolina and a little bit in South Carolina. from the Charlotte area. So you think of Billy Graham and big names like that from the Charlotte area. If you're ever down there, go check out the Billy Graham Library. It's wonderful. But yeah, I definitely grew up in a very churched area. Actually, I think before I moved up here, I don't know what the current statistic is, but I think Charlotte was the most church city in the United States, and like per capita, number of churches per people. And so yeah, a lot of churches and a lot of big churches.
A little different than here?
Quite different, yes, quite different.
So what kind of church background do you have?
So I grew up in the United Methodist Church, actually a church that was pretty much right in our backyard. And I would say I was nominally a Christian. I would have told people I was a Christian. But it wasn't until I went to college that I really encountered what I would say real vibrant Christian faith. And, and at that time, was playing baseball, and some guys on the team began to share Christ with me, and they had connection to a ministry called Campus Outreach on the college campus, and that was kind of generally, I would say, Presbyterian, maybe some Reformed Baptist in there. So I was exposed to the Reformed tradition somewhat early on in my walk with Jesus, and then of course later on I would go to Reformed Seminary.
Oh wow! And that where is that located?
The particular campus I went to is in Charlotte. Reformed Seminary has a number of branches or satellites. So I think there's one in D.C., there's one in Orlando, there's one out in Texas, there's one down in where is Mississippi maybe. There's several spread throughout the Southeast, but I went to the Charlotte campus.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, I will say you do have a little bit of an accent, I would say. Maybe people tell you that. I mean, it's not really strong. I mean, you are now in South Royalton, so it is it's south, right? Yeah. No, but I mean, the accents here, in New England, they're a little different than where you're from. But how did you get from Charlotte to New England? I mean, how did you get from all the way down there up here?
That's a good question. Well, it's really, I mean, this may sound cliche. It was just a kind of a God thing, or very much a God thing. When I was in seminary, I came up, on an article or was talking with someone. I don't remember exactly how it first happened, but I became aware that New England was the least religious, sector of our country. Yeah. And I think traditionally it's been the Northwest, and within like maybe the last 10, 15 years or so, New England surpassed the Northwest with that sort of infamous distinction.
Yes, the least churched area of the country, which I think right now in Vermont, is it even as low as the teens as people? How many people attend church regularly? Like 15% or something like that even go to church?
Yeah, it's low. I don't know what the current exact number is. When I moved up here, I know it was something on the order of, it was under 30% of people that considered themselves religious in any way, shape, or form.
Wow.
And so that's all religions. And of that percentage, of course, there would maybe half would be Christian, and then there would be another portion of that actually considered that a major part of their life, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So it's a very low percentage. So I came across this information while I was in seminary, and I just felt a nudge, that maybe this would be a place that would be, God, that the Lord might call me to, and I just kind of began to seek opportunities, and one thing led to another, and here I am. So.
So glad that you're up here in New England. I'm so thrilled, and I hope people watching can just see God is bringing so many people here. And of course, what's exciting is to see the people who are from here, right? Yes. That are coming to the Lord and that are excited and passionate. But it's great that God is sending laborers into the harvest and using people from all over. I'm from New Jersey, and God led me up here. So it's neat. And that's why we're here together, is because God allowed our paths to cross. So it's so cool. So I want to kind of get your take on how you're acclimating to being here. Do you feel like there are things that you've really enjoyed being here and that you like a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's definitely some things I've struggled with, I'll be honest. The winter has been a bit of a kind of a slap in the face.
Can you believe that winter in New England is kind of hard?
Yes, it's been, I would describe it as maybe cold water in the face or whatever.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes just ice in the face,
yes,
right? The water just immediately freezes.
That's right. So winter's been an adjustment. There's a lot of what I would call the seasonal affectiveness disorder struggles. I think probably this past winter was maybe the first one I really began to say that I was dealing with some of that.
So people that are outside of colder climates, there are time periods, you may know, that there's such a low amount of sunshine that people are actually, their mood is drastically affected, and that's what you're talking about.
That's right, and many people, in fact, I would gather that most people up here have a pretty serious vitamin D deficiency, and that it really affects your mood, it affects your energy levels and all kind of stuff. So that's been hard. That's been an adjustment. I don't think I even heard of it when I was down south.
You had plenty of vitamin D down
lots
there.
Lots of sun. Down there you're dealing with sunburn. Up here
you're kind of trying to avoid the sun where you're from.
That's right.
Here we're like, where is it? Where'd the sun go?
That's right. So that's been a big adjustment, and probably, I think my wife would echo that, certainly. Another thing for us that was a particular challenge was the rural aspect of things. We come from a major city. Charlotte is,
pretty big,
becoming quite the metropolis.
Yeah.
And I think actually Charlotte, they say on an average workday, has a couple of million people or something, in it, which is like several times the amount of people in the whole state of Vermont. And so moving from that to here, our town here has about as many people as I went to high school with. And so, that's an adjustment. It's a different pace of life.
Yeah.
It's different going into town, and most everyone knows who you are. You may know them. And so, a little errand, going to the post office or to the supermarket, something that might take a few minutes can oftentimes turn into quite a long conversation, which is good and fine. But those are things that just take some getting used to. And so, and there's a number of other things as well. But
I can imagine going from Charlotte to, so what's the population of South Royalton?
It's a little over 3,000, I believe, yeah.
In South Royalton. And
South
then
Royalton.
There's Royalton.
Yep. Royalton is actually, that's something I need to get clarity on, because I think Royalton includes South Royalton.
Okay.
I think.
So 3,000 might be everybody in both those towns.
That might be,
which wouldn't surprise me. There's a law school here in South Royalton. So does that add to the population you're talking about?
Well, that would be probably an additional maybe 500 or 600 students. I think there's a little over 600 there this year.
Okay.
And so, if you include the law school, which is a very transient community, they're definitely a big part of the community, but they're transient, so they'll come in and then, they're here a year or two or three, and then they take off. But it might be 3,500 if you count the students over at the law school and whatnot.
Okay. So not very big compared to Charlotte, and then the terrain. It's mountainous. It's snowy in Vermont.
Yep.
So you're dealing with a lot of changes.
The salt, the ice. I mean, driving.
Cars don't last as long here.
No,
because of all the salt and the rust and that.
That's right. and transportation is critical here. And that's a lot of the local people that are struggling with poverty and whatnot. That would be one of the big contributing factors, is difficulty getting transportation, getting to work from work.
Oh yeah, because you can't just walk very easily to places around here. No. I mean, it's quite a distance, as you mentioned.
That's right.
Yeah. What about food? Do you miss anything from back home? Like, is there any kind of food, for example, that you're like,
yes,
they just don't make it up here like they do down in Charlotte?
I certainly grew up on what I would call a standard Southern diet.
Fried? A little bit? Is it a little fried?
Yes, a lot fried. We fried our water.
Wow. Well, actually down there it kind of fries itself, if you leave it out in the sun too long.
That's right. The rivers are boiling.
Yeah.
We enjoyed, like growing up, it was not uncommon for us to have, country style steak and fried chicken, fried okra.
Yep.
Lots of bread, biscuits, rolls, butter on everything, lots of salt.
Ooh, I'm starting to get hungry now.
Yeah, I mean, we did, my mom would mingle in the occasional salad and whatnot, at least so we felt like we were kind of
That's right.
trying to be healthy. But yeah, that was just kind of just the way we ate. And so I miss a lot of that. You can find that here, but it's a little harder. So we don't, and probably it's been beneficial for us to not obviously fry so much food in our home and whatnot.
It's a little healthier, actually.
Yes, much healthier. Yeah, much healthier.
Yeah.
So we do, our eating habits have had to, adjust quite a bit, and we do more soups, more baked things and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the things I love about New England, especially during the winters, is the soups. A lot of chowders up here.
Oh yeah.
And of course, I have a gluten intolerance, so I can do chowders, but they have to be thickened with cornstarch or some other kind of flour.
Okay. So can you do New England clam chowder? Something like that? If it's made the right way.
Yes, if it's made the right way, absolutely.
Is that one of your favorites, chowder?
Yeah, I love the chowder. We've done, like here at the church, we used to have a community supper here. And each year, one of the more popular items that we would do during the winter months was a fish chowder. So there was a gentleman who come to the church and do a big fish chowder. And I always really, really enjoyed the fish chowder. But it's not something I would have eaten down south. So that's one of the
So that's one thing you like up here. Anything else that you really like up here?
Well, I love the seasonal changes. That's
we're in the fall right now.
Yeah, you
Everybody
really
hears
can't,
about fall in Vermont.
You can't beat the fall up here. It's incredible. Winter is beautiful. I think the hard part about the winter is its length. It's harsh and it's long.
But it is pretty.
It's gorgeous.
The snow's beautiful. And let me say, Vermont, I live right across the river in New Hampshire, but Vermont, you just have the green mountains and they get covered with snow. It's very beautiful, the topography here. So
yeah, the frozen lakes.
Gorgeous.
So that would definitely be one of my more favorite parts about New England.
So what about ministering here in New England? Is there anything that you find is particularly challenging since you've been here?
Yes. I think there's people in New England are, and they would, if we had the average New Englander in here with us, I think they would echo this. New Englanders are strong people, and so they are independent, they're self-reliant. And so that doesn't quickly lend itself to an openness to the gospel. You need to really see your need for God, need for grace and forgiveness and all of those things. And a lot of New Englanders, I think, maybe at least on the front end have difficulty seeing that or feeling that need. And so there's a toughness among the people here that makes, gospel ministry sometimes difficult. So that's been hard. I think people are isolated up here, and so you start talking about Christian community. There's all these one another commands in the scriptures. There's emphasis on being together. Those are things that again New Englanders are right, wrong, good or bad, just resistant to or don't understand. There's again very sort of independent spirit here.
Sure.
People have they live up on their mountain and they kind of want to be left alone. And
if you wanted to live with a lot of people, Vermont would not be the place to do it, really. If that was your goal, is to be around a lot of people all the time. These are very the populations are very scattered, and there's a lot more areas where, like you said, people can just live much more on their own. And they get used to that.
They do. And and also I think over time, I don't know if this is the way it was when people hundreds of years ago came and settled here. If people were like this then, but now I find that Vermonters are generally speaking very introverted. I tell people I kind of describe Vermont as a culture of introverts. And it
I'm
makes
from
sense.
New Jersey, and they're not introverts.
No.
Hey, New Jersey peeps, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, down there it's very loud. Very loud place in New Jersey,
That's funny. Well, and I guess, when you think of urban areas, which I don't know, I'm sure Jersey has its more rural parts, but
a little bit here and there, yeah.
If you want to be around people, you're going to go to the city.
Right.
And here, people move to Vermont not because, like you said, they want necessarily community. maybe there's some of that. There certainly are some lovely communities in Vermont. Certainly South Royalton is one of those. But you still have a lot of privacy. You still have a lot of your personal space. You've got your own, property, your land, and and that is often very isolated from others. And so, so people, I think, over time, there's an expectation of quiet and solitude and privacy that comes with living in Vermont, and that doesn't always quickly lend itself to rich gospel community.
It's not a given or even necessarily desirable, the idea of getting together. What's interesting about it is some of us, depending on our church background, we're kind of just used to, isn't the more the better, the more the merrier, as they say, when it comes to church. Having a big church seems like a great thing. But for some people in this area, that's actually a turnoff. They don't want something where there's too many people around, right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So you got to keep it small. So let's talk about that a little bit. What are ways that you feel you've been able to tap into the mindset and the proclivities of the people, what their tendency are here? How do you bring the gospel? How do you bring church into their lives?
I think the biggest thing for me is just getting to know the people, spending time with them. It's entering into their daily life. Going to the soccer game, helping them plow their driveways. Sitting at the local diners and having coffee. So
important, one-on-one.
That's right, just being with the people.
And they do like coffee and eating here. So
they do. Yeah, there's quite a few people in my congregation that I don't know that I've ever seen without a coffee cup in their hand. So they're out plowing the driveway with their coffee mug.
Hey, like we talked about, it gets cold, so some of it's just survival. They're just trying to stay warm all the time.
Pumping the heat in.
Then again, you've probably noticed there are those people in New England that they drink iced coffee all year round, and I think that's the weirdest thing in the world in the middle of winter.
I enjoy an iced coffee sometimes in the winter. So I
digress. So one of the things I know that you did, though, was you started an Alpha course.
Yes.
And your church has done that in the past, but you're helping lead this one. And I have observed coming to it, because I'm helping with it, that it's been really good. Alpha is a conversational evangelistic course. You do watch videos or listen to teaching, but a lot of it's spent in getting to know people, eating together, and then having conversations. So again, it's that very personal thing.
Yes. That
one-on-one kind of thing that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so mentioning the Alpha course, we've done something similar, not as directly evangelistic, but definitely an effort to rub shoulders with our community and meet our community where they are. We've started a food shelf, and so our community, actually a church down the road that unfortunately closed its doors a number of years ago, maintained a food shelf for a while, and the future of the food shelf was quite uncertain when the church closed. And so our church basically stepped up and said, "Hey, we'd like to consider helping with this ministry, this program, if possible." And so we've taken that on, and actually we purchased a building a couple of years ago, just a mile-ish down the road, and that's where we house the food shelf now. And so that's another way that we've really wanted to connect with our community and do
tangible
something.
Things that really show your care for the community.
That's right.
Is really important. That's awesome.
Yeah, and we put on a lot of events. Our church, this was long before I was here, they started, I guess it was them along with another church maybe, some maybe 40 years ago, started a Christmas pageant. And so we put on a live nativity. And we, I think it's typically a Sunday or 2 Sundays before Christmas. Everyone gathers out in front of the church on the park, and we walk around. And we literally, last year we had live donkeys, and Mary and Joseph riding along and going to the inn. We have a local inn that they stop in front of, and you've got the innkeeper saying, there's no room.
Is it actually a Vermont inn that you guys use?
It's not an inn currently, but it was called the Royalton House, and it was and it still looks very much like an old hotel. It's right on the park, right over there, and you can walk out the front door and see it. But today it's been remodeled to be apartments for law school students, And so, but we go out front of that at the pageant as if it were an active inn, and then we move over to where the shepherds on the park are, and the whole thing. It's really wonderful. But that's a way we connect with our community is through events like that too.
And that's key, that word connection, and it really is about love, isn't it? I know your heart, Josh, and I just that you would come from where you did up here. And it's just so awesome, just that God gives you that love for the people, even though it's really out of, it's not what you're used to, right? It's very different from what you told me, but God has given you love for the people of here. That's awesome. All right, so my next question is about Bible translation, because it's a topic that I think is fascinating, and I'm sure you've watched all my videos on it. But I like to ask people what translation they use, and I noticed in your church you have the ESV. So do you use this?
We do, yeah, and I do. The church when I got here was using the 1984 NIV. Okay. And that was a beloved translation, but I'm sure, as you know, a guy who's into Bible translations, that they don't publish that one anymore, actually, the 1984
They updated
version.
it to the 2011 edition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And our congregation, after looking into that, we didn't care for that revision as much as the 1984, and we didn't really want to buy used, try and find a lot of 1984 NIV. So, right. And then plus, I personally prefer more of a literal style translation. So the ESV pulls you back more toward the literal. Yeah. It does, and it's readable. It's when I first came to faith, I read the NIV for a while, and then not long, maybe a couple years into my walk with God, I found an old NASB, and that's the Bible I used for a number of years, which is maybe one of the more literal, extreme kind of literal types, very wooden in its style. And when do you know what years that was about? So for me, that would have been, let's see, probably 2004 or 5-ish. Because I will say the 95 NASB was an improvement over the original from what I've heard, but it still kind of has certain spots that maybe aren't as smooth. And I don't know if this was the newer. It may have been the older edition. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but you're right. The ESV, generally people think it's smooth, and it is tied in with the King James heritage. Yes. Yeah. So I mean, it's a little different than the King James. Obviously, there's some differences there, but it still has kind of connections, I would say, with the King James. So that can be nice. Yeah, yeah, and I, my family grew up, with a King James Bible in the home. We didn't read it a tremendous amount, but I did grow up with some familiarity with the King James and a lot of those, a lot of the language and the idioms that come out of the King James. Yes. And so, but yeah, I like the literal style. So the ESV is one of my favorites. I do still read from the NAS from time to time. I've got a Holman Christian Bible that I'll refer to from time to time. Good. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. And a couple of wonderful study Bibles. I've got an ESV study Bible. I've got an apologetics study Bible that's really wonderful. Which I think is. I was going to ask you about study Bibles. So you said you have an ESV study Bible, apologetics study Bible, and so you obviously think that they can have a good place in a person's library. I do. I mean, my one caution with the study Bibles would simply be. I don't know that they're helpful for beginners, which I know seems counterintuitive. That's interesting. I think our inclination would be to say, "Oh, this guy's new to the faith. Here's a study Bible," Because then he would get to know some things right away. Yes, I think that's the inclination. But I think what it can do, again, it depends on the person, but what it can do is sort of maybe short circuit the learning process. I think it can become easy for a person who's reading a passage and maybe bumps up, against something confusing or that they don't readily understand, and they just jump down to the bottom and say, "Oh, what do the authors, the editors think?" That's a good point. Yeah. Instead of wrestling with it and praying about it, or maybe getting advice from other people and kind of having dialogue, learning how to really search those matters out for yourself. That's right. Do cross-referencing and bouncing around. Yes. So maybe like a more of a reference Bible would be good
for a
Yes.
new believer, where,
Yes.
yeah, it has some helps, maybe even a little synopsis of the book.
Yes.
And I know the ESV does put Bibles like their classic reference Bible is just like that, and that is really nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
good.
and I love the reference Bibles. I love ones that might even have in the back a little dictionary or concordance of sorts.
Yes.
I think that can all be very helpful, and that's what I had in my first NIV and in the NAS, and found this very useful. So.
Wow. So you definitely, obviously, you came from a more, I think you said Methodist background.
Yeah. As a child.
But
yeah.
as a child, and then in college, those years is when that's when the gospel really penetrated and made a major
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
And so, and you were reading the scripture a lot more at that point, it
Yes.
sounds like.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, that has had a lot of grounding in your faith from what I can tell, which kind of brings me to the topic of you're in New England, and let's face it, not all the churches here have the same view of the Bible.
To say the least. Yeah.
But even in your training and background, you've experienced people who have different views of the Bible. So for you, the Bible, it definitely carries a lot of weight.
Yes.
So how do you feel about the Bible? I mean, what do you see as your perspective on the Bible itself?
Well, I think the teaching of the Scriptures. So in our gathered worship, my personal conviction is that should be the central aspect of our worship. Our worship should be governed by the Scriptures. The famous reformers of the Reformed tradition, they talk a lot about the regulative principle, which is the idea that the Scriptures should regulate and determine what is acceptable in worship and what is not.
Okay.
And that all the things that we do in worship are governed by the Scriptures. And of course, even that principle can be interpreted and taken in many different ways. And I won't get all into that right here, but I think the Scriptures, should be the place that we go, obviously, to know how to live as Christians, and it should be the center of our gathered worship. And I think that's a Protestant principle.
Yes.
Moving out of really in Catholicism, the Eucharist was the central part in all of the theology and understanding that came around that Christ's literal physical presence was in the bread and the wine. And moving away from that in the Protestant tradition, which is movement towards the Word being central, the preached Word,
Yes.
and the message of the gospel. And so that's kind of where I am. I think that our churches, and I certainly have sought to practice that here at Red Door Church, to make the Word central. So I have a deep love for the Bible, and that was really something I was exposed to in campus outreach. I learned through discipleship. I'm so thankful for my exposure and my time in campus outreach, and then continuing later on at RTS. But in campus outreach, basically, it was a sort of a discipleship style ministry. It wasn't pure evangelism. We did lots of evangelism, going around on campus, sharing our faith, trying to get to know students in the dormitories. I lived 4 years in the dorms, which was crazy to all my teammates, who lived off campus in the apartments. I kept living in these little dorms, these 12 by 12 rooms. And I did that because that was a way to get to know people and to share Christ with them. And so, but we learned through that, that real close-knit kind of life, what it was to be in a real discipleship style relationship, life on life. And so, so my leaders in campus outreach, we met regularly, and they taught me about being in the Scriptures consistently and how to read the Scriptures and study them. And so from those earliest days, that was really ingrained, the importance of abiding in Christ and abiding in the Word of God, knowing it, loving it, treasuring it.
And I assume that was reinforced a lot at Reformed Seminary.
Yes.
They would have been a very Scripture-centered institution.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, so Reformed, one of the distinctions from other seminaries, actually even in the Charlotte area, there's another very, very reputable, good school there called Southern Evangelical Seminary. But their focus is more philosophy and apologetics. Wonderful institution as well. But RTS would want to put more emphasis on the scriptures. Not to say that SES doesn't put emphasis there. Don't hear me wrong, folks. They definitely do, and they do a wonderful job. But they're more interested in philosophy and apologetics, I would say. Or that's my understanding from speaking with other friends and folks that go there. So RTS really wants to focus on the scriptures, and so they're going to make sure, like if you're pursuing an MDiv, you're going to study all the books of the Bible. You're going to have, you're going to be in the Pentateuch. You're going to be in historical books. You're going to have classes on the wisdom literature and on the Gospels and on Paul and all of those things. You're going to look at it all. And so yeah, that was really ingrained in me as well at RTS, a real love for the Word of God. Yeah.
See, now I'm from a fundamental Baptist background, so you better believe we use the Bible. And a certain one actually tended to be the one. But I will say that I've learned a lot by interacting with various Christians over the years. I still believe the Bible, but I know that, fundamentalist Baptist, and of course it's what you mean by that. But there are groups that are very, very rigid, shall we say, right, on the fundamentalist side. And then you have groups that we might call liberal. And depending on what you mean by that, that can be a bad word to either group.
Yes.
Right? I mean, to fundamentalists, liberal is like the worst thing in the world. And to liberals, fundamentalist is really bad. Yes. I think I actually spoke at a church in New England once, and someone wanted to know before I went there, is he a fundamentalist? Yeah. So, depending on your background and your setting. So what has it been like for you in New England? I mean, do you feel your belief in the Scripture has been challenged at all? How about in your denomination and that sort of thing?
Yes, absolutely. I would say definitely I've been stretched in my understanding of things. I think not so much questioning, whether or not, say, all of the Bible is inspired or whether or not it's infallible or inerrant. I still use those terms, my personal view of the Scriptures. But I've definitely gotten a lot of pushback, and some from within my own denomination, certainly. That definitely get a lot of pushback there. And, the UCC, the United Church of Christ, it would be fair to say, and I think they would wave this flag very proudly, that they are probably the most liberal, other than the Unitarian Universalists, probably the most liberal Protestant denomination that there is.
So liberal is a good word to many in those circles.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And why? Why is that a good thing to them? Well, the idea of liberal, I mean.
Yeah, I think they would associate the word liberal with sort of a how do you want to say, putting maybe stress on love, the primacy of love, that love is the most important thing. Right.
Compassion, generosity, care. Yeah. Those would be some, I think, important values for people.
That's right.
Coming from that perspective.
Yeah, those are very popular buzzwords in the liberal community.
Yep. And they're good words, actually, and I think you agree with them on some level. I do too.
Yeah, absolutely. I would define some of them differently.
Right.
But obviously, as
like
Christians,
love, for example.
Love, yes,
right?
Love,
maybe?
exactly. And so I think of course on both ends, I think the fundamentalists and the liberals, both of them mean well. Both of them believe that they're doing the right thing and that they're
doing God's work,
and that their understanding of things is the right way or whatever. And so we certainly don't want to discredit either group on those grounds. But certainly I would say my views have been very much challenged. And I would probably the best way to describe it would be to say that not so much my pure convictions. I don't know that many of my pure convictions have been challenged, but it's more of the way I live those convictions that have been challenged. It's the sort of practical, day-to-day living it out where I've really had to grow and mature and be stretched. And I obviously still struggle tremendously with all of that. But
is there like a particular area that you could think of where it's been challenging for you, in this, being right here in this region?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think probably the most week-to-week struggle is with tradition.
Okay.
Yeah, so the understanding of so coming into a church, again, I come from a Reformed, Presbyterian, Reformed Baptist, kind of those circles, and coming into a Methodist environment, and coming into a what is probably, to my friends, would be considered a highly liturgical church.
Okay.
We have a lot of sort of various elements in our worship, and we stick to those very
And you
tightly.
weren't from as a liturgical background?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Reformed church that I went to for probably the majority of my sort of upbringing in the faith or whatever, is certainly, I mean, every church has liturgy. It's not like,
Sure.
these churches have liturgy and these don't.
Right. There's a pattern you follow for your worship is basically
Exactly.
what it comes
That's
down
it.
to.
So everyone's following some kind of order. But some are more rigid in the sense that there's less room for spontaneity. There are churches that would open
Yeah.
the floor up and
Well put.
allow people to speak and share something.
Extemporaneous forms of worship.
Yes.
Which I'm, again, Baptist, very extemporaneous, especially the kinds of circles I was in. Prayers were never written, ever. Although that can be good, actually, right? There can be a good part to planning things out,
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
kind of what you're saying is it can be a sacred cow almost for some people or in certain situations.
Yes, and that would be, I think, one of the challenges that I face, not just in this church, but in talking with many of my other pastor friends, that there are a lot of things, especially when people are coming from a different tradition, different understanding, or coming from outside the area and into a new place, and you're able to see things maybe that the folks that have been immersed in them for so long don't see. And then there's things about myself and my understanding that have been revealed to me that I didn't see before. And so that sort of, I don't want to call it a clash is maybe too strong, but just that sort of, that overlap or tension or whatever you want to call it has been a really challenge, I think, for me. So coming to a place and asking questions of okay, why do we sing these songs so much? Or why does this part of the service follow that part of the service? Why do we feel the need to do this particular ministry? Or why do we put so much money here? Those kinds of questions have been, as a pastor, probably some of the most challenging, and even theologically.
And you're fine asking those questions.
Yes.
Is kind of what I hear. It's more that people kind of hold strongly to some of those things when they've done them that way for so long.
Yes, I think it's not that any of it's wrong or bad.
Sure.
It's more so trying to get people to think about why we do what we do.
Right.
It's asking, well, what is our worship saying?
Okay.
What is what is our forms and our traditions? What are they communicating about God and about ourselves? Getting people to think more of that way and getting them to wrestle with some of those questions instead of just saying, well, this is what we've always done.
Yeah.
This is kind of the way it is here. That's not really an answer. And I think it's wrestling with some of those things. And then also seeking to love and listen and understand, to change in my own understanding or my own way of life if that's needed.
Yeah.
So that, I would say, has been, for me, a real challenge in New England. New England is, because we tend to associate progressivism with change, right? That's what progress, change. But interestingly, here in New England, people are hardcore historians, and they want to stick to their history. Right. They don't want to tear old buildings down.
Yep.
We've always done it this way. And so you've got this really interesting mix of very sort of progressive, liberal social thinking and theological understanding, but yet when it comes to institutions and traditions, very conservative, don't want things to change. And so
so we will marry gay people here in New England. That's pretty common, but we'll do it in a traditional way. Right. It's kind of what I'm hearing, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's kind of that exact coming together of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's liberal in terms of social, moral thinking and what's looked at as progress there, but traditional in our forms.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And I've wrestled a lot with that. Yeah. Just really struggling with what does it look like to bring about healthy change
Yeah.
What does it look like? Like, what is enough time? Those struggling with those questions of, you want to come into a ministry, be patient, and all of that.
But how much time do you allow things to not change?
Yes, those kind of questions.
Yeah.
And then also understanding, to me, and this is where humility becomes such a key factor, I think, in any kind of thing we're doing, really anything in life, but especially in ministry, saying, where do I need to change, Because am I making assumptions? Are my expectations wrong? And really trying to filter that. Those have been for me.
Yeah, and we all do need to change. Yeah. But as pastors, there's a responsibility there, and people are looking, to you, and they're looking for guidance.
Yeah.
And we have to speak, right? And it takes sometimes both compassion and courage, and navigating the issues in our culture are really changing rapidly. Right?
Yeah. Oh,
And again, we're kind of on the forefront sometimes in New England in certain ways. So,
absolutely.
I think of something like marriage, right? And how we're going to deal with that issue. And even we've talked privately before about marriage and divorce.
Yep.
It's a very tricky issue in our culture.
Yeah.
But certainly same-sex marriage is an issue. So, what are your thoughts on how do we navigate this situation in our cultural moment? I mean, what are you doing to kind of think through all of this stuff?
Honestly, I don't know that I have any. I wish I had some real clever answers. I
want a clever answer. I want something clever right now. Yeah. But I mean, I do think I see, like, going back to our conversation on Scripture, right?
Yeah.
We have to go back there. Of course, it's not always that simple. The Bible isn't like an instruction manual per se, where it says this is how you will. It doesn't give every.
Yeah. In this situation, we're going to do this, and in that situation.
And even with our sexuality, I think there's really a lot there.
Yeah.
But I think that's what I see you doing. I mean, you're thinking through things, but you're thinking through them in light of Scripture.
Yes.
So.
Well, I guess the one thing I would say that to offer a quick thought is I think the tendency of the church has been, again, this is my experience in the circles that I run in, so this is not going to be everyone's experience, so I understand that, but in my experience, the tendency of the church is slow and gradual compromise. So so there's a conflict with culture over whatever the issue is, whether it be marriage or sexuality or capitalism or you name the controversial topic today, and maybe what the church once said they begin to question and wrestle with, and then there's a slow move this direction, and then a slow move and a slow move, and eventually a full-on departure. And so I think as I've wrestled with it, I've been grieved by that tendency. Not that every departure, of course, has been wrong or bad. We've certainly had, the church has certainly made some gross mistakes in the past, absolutely. And we've needed to move away from some of our historic positions. That's absolutely should be said.
But those were also cultural things too.
Yes.
We have to add in there. In other words, it wasn't always that the church really was saying, this is what God says. I mean, they may have said that, but a lot of it actually had to do with the cultures, right?
That's right.
So
they were echoing what was already popular or felt in the culture.
So that's kind of,
And I think that's what we've seen today. And I think the question is, are we really seeking to hear from God and understand His will as it's revealed in Scripture?
Yeah.
And then out of that grows, how we should live, what we should do, how we respond to the challenges of culture.
Yes.
And so I think for me, my way in some of these, controversial topics or spaces, conversations. Again, for me, being a conservative in a very moderate to very progressive atmosphere in the UCC and in Vermont, New England, is not to say, okay, I disagree with this person, therefore I must be wrong, let me change my view, which has kind of been the tendency of the culture. Instead, or the tendency, of the church culture, of the church.
Right.
Instead, responding and saying, you know what, even though I disagree, there has to be a way we can love each other, there has to be a way that I can still honor and respect this person, listen to them well, care for them, and then hopefully that love covers. Love begins to build a bridge. Love begins to win and gain respect instead of trying to win and gain respect by changing my view, which is really not, I would say, really a victory at all. So I think that's the way I've learned to navigate it. It's not by giving up my perspectives, but by trying to give more love and trying to go low and to say, I want to listen more, I want to hear more, but I'm not going to necessarily give up.
That's a good point. I think when our culture is, whatever our culture is dealing with, it creates this tension for a lot of Christians, and it's knowing how to deal with that. And it's very hard. It's very challenging, like anything, right? When you have something that brings discomfort, your natural tendency is to avoid or to confront. It kind of extremes there.
That's
and
right.
I think avoidance and kind of just acquiescing to acquiescing, if that's the word. However you say it, but you know what I'm saying. That, we're just going to say, okay, let's just go along with it. And sometimes we're drawn by the arguments and the appeals, and we get it. And we, as humans, we are very impacted by emotion. And I think with certain issues in our culture that we've, progressed on, or what's called progression, has to do with these emotional arguments.
Yes.
On the other hand, the emotional reaction the other way can be strong. In other words, we just emotionally say, that's so bad, or I don't agree with it. And then I hear in you that third way. It's a very challenging way. But I see it in Jesus. Yeah. I see it in what the writers of Scripture are saying. We have to challenge.
Yes.
And I love that about you. I mean, you do teach very clearly, but you do it in a very kind and I think a very understanding way. And that's important. Of course, some of this, too, gets to our gifting, and I think you and I are similar in some ways. I think we've talked about this before. Someone like Luther, Martin Luther, was not a soft pedaling person.
Bull in a china shop.
So there's people that do fulfill, I think, good purposes. And sometimes we have to admit, sometimes we do need change, right? Sometimes we need progress, if you're going to call it that. Other times, though, we don't need that. We don't need to change. And it's knowing what we need to change and knowing what not to change. That can be challenging.
That's exactly right. And looking at the example of Jesus, that Jesus brought change through suffering. And so he taught, and people believed his message, so some change came that way. But in the end, the change that Christ brought was at his own expense. So he preached the truth and he taught the truth to the point of dying for these people he was trying to reach.
It's real love. It's doing it out of love.
That's right. And sometimes I think that we have to win the argument. We have to be right and get the other person to see that. Well, sometimes we can hold our perspective and receive the indignation or the whatever the people might say about us, and we receive it in love, and we receive it as Jesus did. And that's a humble way of saying, I can't change my perspective here because this is what God has said, and I'm going to stick to what he said, but I still love you, and I'm willing to take it and to model that kind of, it's Philippians 2 where Paul's talking about how Christ became a servant and he died on the cross. He was obedient to the point of death, is the way Paul says it. Became a servant. That's love. And I think that's what we need. That's the way forward.
So as you're talking about all this stuff about how we relate to people and really doing it out of love, it's soul searching for ourselves. And it is hard. We need the grace of God, I think, to approach these matters in the right way. But boy, we're going to feel this more and more. My comment, too, is as you were talking, I was thinking about the abortion issue. And for me, I'm pro-life. And I think the church initially reacted just with anger when that shifted in our culture. And for understandable reasons. But then you've got people that just, again, they accommodate. They say, okay, well, if that's what people are saying we should do, we should just do it. But I think the church that has been pro-life has said, you know what, we do need to care for single mothers. We do need to be there. I love these pregnancy centers that are going out there and that are saying, we're going to support them emotionally and spiritually, every way that we can, with the decision they have to make. But we're going to show them the truth. We're going to share truth with them. And I think that's what you're talking about
That's
here.
it.
Right? It's not
Absolutely.
compromising, but it's having true care and compassion. And like you said, humility. I love what you said about being willing to take the hardship. But to do those things that we've done in the area of abortion, it's cost us more. Another area would be like adoption, right? And foster care. And my family's been involved in that. And but that takes it on yourself. But that's the way of Jesus.
It is.
Right? Taking it on yourself.
That's right. And well, in the early church, I think, really understood this. A lot of stories about babies that would be left out to be exposed in the early church. And instead of just discarding these children, the Christians would go to these places where the children were left out, and they would bring them into their homes and effectively adopt them and nurture them. And that's one of the ways the Christian church in those early centuries grew so rapidly. And what a model, though, for us. I mean, because that's costly. Financially, you've got more mouths to feed. It's you're going to lose your sleep and all the challenges that come with having kids. And so that's a suffering. It's receiving something very difficult. And
there's a modern day example of that too. If you've ever seen this documentary called The Dropbox, where a man in Korea, was it Korea? Somewhere in the Asian part of the world. Sorry, I don't remember, but I think it was somewhere over there where there were people that were literally just discarding their babies. And so he created a Dropbox where they could leave a child.
Wow.
And he and a team of people would take care. And someone did a documentary on this. You got to watch this if you haven't.
That sounds incredible.
And
I'll have to watch
not only, the guy who did the documentary, not only was it incredible, the whole story of that, but at the end of the movie, you find out the guy who did the documentary became a Christian because of that.
Wow.
Because of what he witnessed. It was just, it revolutionized his life.
Wow, that's powerful. Wow. That's amazing. But that's what an example, though. I mean, of this way forwards. Instead of saying, let's compromise, let's change our views, let's capitulate. Which again, I think there's a time and a place to really reevaluate where we are and wrestle with those things.
At least how we're approaching the issue, if not
that's right.
changing perspectives at times. Yeah,
and we should always, I think, be doing some of that. But I think this is a better model. It's it's becoming a servant, willing to suffer, to embrace the retribution or deprivation or whatever might come as a result of our perspectives and our views, and just continue to love and pray for those who take a different perspective or see things differently. I think that's a more Christ-like model, personally.
That's good. So why don't we get into talking here, kind of winding down a little bit, but talking about, some authors or books that you have found useful or that you might, I know that, who knows who's going to listen to this? But I mean, other than the Bible, we encourage you to read the Bible. Are there any other? Are there any other that you come to your mind that you would recommend or that have influenced you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll rattle off a large.
Please say my book. I'm sorry.
I was actually very close to bringing a copy of your book. Saying, "Whoa."
That's been done already in the last interview. If we keep doing that, they're going to catch on.
Okay. That's funny. Early on in my Christian walk, reading books like, and I don't endorse every aspect of every book I'm going to list.
That's the caveat, right?
Let's say that. But I found Wild at Heart, John Eldridge's book, really helpful early on in my Christian walk, understanding what it means to be a man and all of that. Then maybe a little later on, or somewhere along the way, I got exposed to the writings of some Reformed guys like John Piper. I really benefited from his book, Desiring God, and interestingly, The Pleasures of God as well. I would recommend that one. That one may be a little bit less well known. Desiring God is his big, famous book. But Pleasures of God was really wonderful. I started to read some of the writings of famous Puritans, and I know in New England,
Yes.
To say the word Puritan is like a curse word, basically. But I used to read.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a history there.
Yeah, absolutely. And not everything, of course, the Puritans did was great. And
Right.
but a lot of their teaching and very much of the traditions that came out of Puritanism were wonderful. And so the writings of guys like John Owen, really loved his communion with God.
Right.
Which is really a dense read. And more recently, I've been reading things by Tim Keller. I really like his book, The Reason for God. I'm really interested in apologetics and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So his book, The Reason for God, is wonderful.
It's interesting because I think he learned a lot from C.S. Lewis in certain ways.
Yep.
And he's
Big
probably
fan of
another writer you like, right?
Yes, C.S. Lewis.
But Keller, I think, is more for today in certain aspects. Lewis, I mean, don't get me wrong, Lewis is timeless, really, in what he says. But he was a product and in a certain setting in terms of history and culture. Yeah. Keller is New York City 2000s, right? And so he does say some things that really hit on today's culture and questions and things that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I love currently you're right on with that, and in sort of a reaction or maybe a balance to a lot of what Keller's been doing, because Keller is very focused on big city, his whole center church movement and the church planning and all that.
It's all about going to cities, big cities.
Yes, which obviously we're not in one of those, and so I've been doing a lot more reading by guys who are focused more on rural ministry, guys like Donnie Griggs. He's written a really wonderful book called Small Town Jesus.
That's cool.
Which is really awesome. And there's another number of books similar to that. There's one that just came out a couple years ago called God's Country, written by a guy out in Kansas. His name is escaping me off the top of my head, but another book on rural ministry, which has been really wonderful. Cool. So those are books I've been slowly going through. And I've been reading, just another random couple of things to throw out there. There's a book called 75 Masterpieces That Every Christian Should Know.
Wow.
It's on great works of art and just kind of the stories behind them. Yeah. I've found that book very refreshing, just kind of, again, slowly going through it every couple of weeks, just reading it, the next piece or whatever in the book. I'm reading a book on liturgy called The Liturgy of the Ordinary. By a woman called Tish Harrison Warren, I think is the full name. That's been really helpful. A book on the importance of doctrine by Dorothy Sayers called Letters to a Diminished Church, which has been really profound and powerful. So, and these are things that, I don't have a tremendous amount of time to read. I wish I had more time, but I kind of keep
it sounds like you read quite a bit. I was thinking, I asked the right question, when I asked you what books. I like this. I hope you don't mind me saying it, but you're a fellow nerd, I think you like to read,
I have
don't
some
you?
nerdiness, for sure. Yeah.
I love it. Thank you. Well, what about you writing? If you could write a book, and maybe you will.
I would love to. I really, really, really would. I'm in a stage of life that makes that pretty hard with young kids and all of that. But I do certainly wrestle with that. I love the topic of prayer. That's something that I feel is very important. It's, of course, many people have written on prayer, but I don't know that we can ever write enough about something like that. That's awesome. There's so much to say about prayer.
Wow.
And then I also like the idea of talking about some of the things we've discussed here.
Yes.
Having some of these hard conversations, like how do we navigate some of these tricky conversations, and when we find ourselves in disagreement with someone, what do we do? I don't know that I would be necessarily the right person to write about that, but I am certainly in a place where I have to have a lot of those conversations, and I come from a tradition that's very different than the one that I'm currently in, and so that presents a lot of opportunities for some of these conversations, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and I've benefited a lot. So that's a topic of interest to me. I'm really grieved by the cultural divide that we see, and it's affected the church. We see it in the church. We see it all around us.
Yes.
And how to have good conversations.
That's
how do we have rich conversations where we can look at a brother or sister in the eye, or someone in the community in the eye, and disagree with them and still love and still respect one another.
Yeah.
and move forwards in relationship. So.
Yep.
So that's
Good.
a topic of a lot of interest to me.
Well, and one of the results of the kind of world we live in now, post fall, is the conflict of relationship, right? And we're always struggling with divisions. And so one theme I've really heard in you, and I appreciate it. I mean, I come from, like I said, a fundamental Baptist background. You're a pastor here in a United Methodist / UCC church, but you believe the Scripture, you love the gospel. And here God has brought us together, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Amen.
so awesome. And I hope this conversation has been edifying to you. I just want to thank Pastor Josh Moore again for taking the time out of his busy schedule to talk with us. Isn't that great? Just great things for us to hear from this man who loves the Lord. So if you have questions or comments, please leave them in the video below. This description of the video, and thank you so much for joining us in the second part of our conversation series on a Frisch perspective. Thank you, Pastor Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.